Each of these conventions, we learn more about the disease of alcoholism and drug addiction than when we come to the convention. And one of the individuals who's been willing to share with us his knowledge and his expertise and his education at MIT and his teaching at Dartmouth and all of those fancy schools up there in the Northeast, he comes to share it with us even when we're in Kansas City. And it is with great pleasure that I introduce to you our board member and the noted Dr. Stuart Gitlow.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, everybody. Afternoon, everybody. So 30 years ago, when can you hear me? Does this work? That doesn't work. Are we on yet? There we go. There we go. So 30 years ago, when I first got into this field, I figured I'd be sitting in my office. Patients would come in from time to time. I'd see them. And they'd go about their business, and I'd go about my business of helping them to get better. And that's what I thought I would do for the rest of my career. I didn't expect that at the 15 or 20 year point, there would suddenly be an opioid crisis. I didn't expect that the country suddenly was going to jump into embracing marijuana and saying it should be legalized. And I certainly didn't expect that we would have a Supreme Court nominee where what we're talking about are not his qualifications, but about something that happened during an alcohol-fueled event years ago. And that is really about, as Matt Damon put it, whether or not drinking alcohol heavily makes you cool. And of course it does. That's the problem. You guys wouldn't be here if it weren't cool to have been doing what you were doing. That was part of it. Until our country recognizes that and turns the conversation to the issue that's really important, things won't change. We'll keep running into the same problem over and over. And the folks who can educate the country about this are sitting right in front of me. Bertha Madras said it best yesterday, educate, educate, educate. What she didn't say is that you guys are the ones who have to do the educating. You're the ones who have to go out there and tell people and show people and learn them about where it is use leads and how they can try and turn things around. Remember, and this is always a tough thing to say because I'm not a fan of prohibition, but you go back 100 years to prohibition and you realize that it was this country's greatest public health success of all time. Prohibition of alcohol lasted about a generation in the early 1900s. During that time, per capita use of alcohol dropped by almost 50%. Alcohol-related illness and death dropped by 2/3. That's an enormous success rate. And yet, there were political problems with it. It was a political failure. And sure, the crime rate went up. Well, of course, if you define something as being illicit, suddenly there are crimes around the illicit nature of what you've defined. So yes, the crime rate went up. But we sat there during Prohibition and saved lives, countless lives. When Prohibition ended, the rate of use of alcohol didn't suddenly jump back up to where it had been before Prohibition. It took a whole generation after that. It wasn't until World War II 20 years after the end of Prohibition, that use of alcohol and the morbidity and mortality related to it went back to where they had been before Prohibition. So I look now at the folks who say, let's look at marijuana in the states that have gotten rid of their prohibition of it. And they'll point out, oh look, use hasn't jumped suddenly. No, it won't jump suddenly. We did this experiment already with alcohol. We ended prohibition of alcohol. It took a generation. It will take a generation with marijuana for us to see what will happen. Roughly, there will be a doubling of use. In the doubling of use, we will double the number of people who end up having addiction issues who wouldn't have had it otherwise. So let's talk about how we get there. First of all, what we're going to do today, how many of you folks have heard me before? Hey, better question, how many have not? Awesome, all right. What we're going to do today is talk about how to construct somebody with addictive disease, how to build one. And this lecture could be called, Is Addiction a Disease? It could be called The 3 Building Blocks of Addiction. We can look at it any number of ways. But remember, if we talk about diabetes, let's do that for a minute. Phil and Steve Mayer are Olympic athletes, downhill skiers. One of them, Phil, was born a few seconds before Steve, but otherwise they're identical twins. Phil won the gold medal in skiing, Steve the silver medal. Why did the two of them come in differently? I mean, the genetics are identical, right? Shouldn't they have skied it exactly the same way? Of course not, right? I mean, they learned differently. One of their legs moved a little differently. One hit a bump in the snow that the other one missed. There's any of a variety of reasons. So you take identical individuals, absolutely identical from a genetic standpoint, and you realize very quickly there's a difference in outcomes. There's a difference in how they present themselves to the world. Difference that'll make a huge difference to them. How do you think the two of them went after that? One of them was a gold medalist. One of them came in second. He'll always be second place. The other interesting thing about Phil and Steve, Steve's diabetic. Phil's not. Why is that? They have the exact same genes. Well, one of them hit a bump in the road, right? The same way as they did skiing. In fact, it's the same guy who hit the bump. And you sit there and say, well, why is it that one of them would have diabetes, a chronic, life-threatening disease, and the other one doesn't when they have the exact same genetic structure? Except for the fact that genes aren't everything. Genes have to be expressed, and for a gene to be expressed, something has to trigger it, something has to make it so it gets expressed. For that to happen, there has to be something taking place in the environment, what we call an environmental trigger. Could be anything, could be a strep infection when you were 7. Could be that you accidentally bumped your head once standing up while you were playing with the dog under the table. Could have been that you were beaten by your old man a little bit harder than the other kid. Could have been any of those. Any one of those could be the environmental trigger necessary to make it so a gene that otherwise wouldn't have expressed itself, expresses itself. So there, Phil and Steve, absolutely identical twins, but their whole way of dealing with the world is different because their life experiences are different, because one of them has an illness that has been expressed and the other one does not. All right, when we're talking about addictive disease, like diabetes, there's a genetic predisposition and an environmental trigger that has to take place in order to make it so that the genetic predisposition is expressed. And then you need a third part, but we'll come to the third part in a bit. Let's look at the first. We're going to talk about alcohol today. By the way, just a reminder, although we are losing somewhere between 50 and 70,000 people per year due to the opioid crisis, let's not forget we're losing 80,000 people a year due to the alcohol crisis. Why is it the alcohol crisis isn't what's featured in the headlines? That hasn't changed, right? Headlines deal with news. News means something is different today than it was yesterday. Because alcohol's been killing 80,000 people a year pretty steadily, year after year after year after year, it's not news. And so no one cares. So the money's going to the other drug instead of to the drug that's causing more of the deaths. Remember, by the way, tobacco, in case you've forgotten tobacco, I know all you are in front of the hotel, you have not forgotten tobacco. I've seen that. 500,000 deaths per year from tobacco, right? So 80,000 alcohol, 500,000 tobacco, and 70,000 opioids. Opioids should be on the back burner someplace in comparison. And yet here they are right up front. It's all right, it's in the news, that's good, gives us a chance to talk about addiction, get our word out, get our message out, that's what's important right now. But let's keep coming back to where the focus ought to be, which is alcohol and tobacco. All right, so we're going to use alcohol today as our prototype. But you can fill in the blank with other drugs as you need to along the way. What we're going to do is talk first about what use of alcohol does to an individual. Could be any one of you. It could be any one of a person who doesn't have addictive disease. In fact, it could be any mammal, a giraffe, a rat, you name it. They'll all respond the exact same way, and we'll draw it out for you. What to remember as we're talking about alcohol and how an individual responds to its use is to realize we're not talking about somebody with alcoholism or an alcohol use disorder or alcohol dependence. What I'm about to talk about exists for 100% of individuals. Here we have a timeline. This is where you start out. That's a baseline. And as you drop down the baseline, you have a little tired, fast asleep, dead. As you go up the timeline, you have a little jittery and uncomfortable, very anxious, grand mal seizure. All right. So that's our range. It can be anywhere from a seizure to dead. But we start out at a baseline where you're right in the middle. When you drink alcohol, let's say you have a beer. Some people, I understand, like beer. You end up with a period that lasts about 2 hours. Now, the amplitude of this curve depends upon how much beer the person drinks. If you drink a lot of beer all at once, you might drink so much that you would die if you don't throw up, right? If you drink just a little tiny bit, it has a very low amplitude and you don't feel it at all. Most people, if they're drinking beer, will drink to the point that they feel something. That's their point of drinking the beer. So they drink the beer, and it lasts for about 2 hours. That's how long this sedation from a single beer drunk all at once lasts. Now, you know very well most people don't drink that way, just have one beer and wait for it to wear off. You want to maintain a certain level of sedation that the beer has caused. And you therefore know how often you have to drink in order to produce that effect. It's about every hour. And it can be the amount that leads to the level of sedation that you desire. So if you start out saying, I like to feel the way I feel when I've had 2 beers, okay? Then an hour before the party, you have your first 2 beers. You then get to the party right here. Okay? You're now at the party, and an hour has passed since your 2 beers. You're about ready for another couple of beers. And so you'll have 2 more. And then 2 more. And so forth. And you will travel along the lower part of that curve. thereby maintaining your level of sedation. But there's something you didn't count on. If I take the chair and I bring it over here, and I let go of the chair, what it did was it didn't just end up right at the center, it went over just a little bit. Not much, but it went past the center point and then came back and rebalanced. The brain does the same thing. It works the same way. Remember, when you go outside and it's a really cold day, your brain makes it so that your body retains heat. One way it does that is to clamp down on the vessels, the blood vessels, in your fingers and toes. Your fingers and toes get cold. But that doesn't happen the moment you walk outside. It takes a little bit. Then when you come back in, it's warm inside. Your fingers and toes don't immediately get warm. It takes a while. Brain has to recalibrate. Each time you have a drink, your brain recalibrates. And so it pushes back against the effects of the sedation. Not very hard at first. It takes a while. And because the brain is slow on purpose to recalibrate, there's a longer curve associated with that recalibration. It takes about 6 to 8 hours, and it comes at the end of the first period of sedation. So we have a period of sedation from the first 2 drinks, and then a period of agitation that you barely notice because it lasts so long. The area under the curve is identical, but it's stretched out, and so is of lower amplitude, less obvious. So if you just drink enough to notice something, you won't notice the agitation. Now, let's look at this guy. This guy had 2 beers, 2 beers, 2 beers, and 2 beers, each one spaced apart. He never got really drunk, right? Blood alcohol level probably was around 0.06, 0.08, somewhere in there, and never really changed markedly from that point. And yet, each time he or she had the 2 beers, there's that agitation that comes as a result of the 2 beers pushing in one direction on the brain. But now you add up the agitation part of the curve, and it adds up because it lasts so long. They don't interconnect nicely, maintaining a level of sedation. They build up because each agitation curve lasts 6 to 8 hours instead of the 2 hours that the sedation lasted initially. The result is that the next morning at about 4 a.m., this is you. And you say, why is this me? Why does my head hurt? I wasn't that drunk last night. Indeed, you were not. But you were intoxicated, albeit mildly, for an extended period of time. And that leads to the hangover. Okay, the extended period of even mild sedation is enough to lead to a very significant agitation the next day. Well, what's the one thing that will correct this? More alcohol, absolutely. That'll bring you right back down. And of course, as it wears off, there'll be another curve, another agitation curve. But it'll be later, and it's more comfortable to have that agitation at noon than it is at 4 in the morning. I understand. But you're just delaying the inevitable. As time passes, and an individual does this repetitively, what ends up happening is each time you're drinking alcohol, you're merely adjusting the agitation that came from previous uses of alcohol. Beyond about 6 to 8 weeks of daily alcohol use, you are largely correcting the discomfort generated from the prior use of alcohol. And that's true no matter what sedative I'm speaking of. Valium, Librium, Ativan, Klonopin, Ambien, Sonata, Lunesta, phenobarb, chloral hydrate, Soma. They all do the same thing. Every one of them gives rise to these 2 curves. in 100% of people. It's why it's useless to give somebody Valium every day for more than 8 weeks, because beyond 8 weeks, what they will be feeling is simply the agitation that results from their having taken Valium every day for the past 8 weeks. And that's what they'll be solving each time they take another Valium. It's not the problem that they originally had. That's now been compounded by adding on to it the agitation and the discomfort that goes along with it. All right. This experiment obviously reaches its limit when this curve rises above the point of having a grand mal seizure, right? That's withdrawal seizures. Not comfortable. You can die. Not a good place to be. So 100% of people I can give enough alcohol to over a long enough period of time that they will have grand mal seizures. This isn't alcoholism. This isn't an alcohol use disorder. An alcohol use disorder is going through this experiment and then saying, heck yeah, I'll do it again. Right? That's the point where I've shown you that holding a lit match under your fingers burns them. And then when I say, you know, I've decided I'm going to use a wooden match this time, can we do that again? Right? But there you are saying, yeah, okay, that looks different. Maybe that won't hurt. That's the disease. The disease is down here, is coming back and starting over again. But be that as it may, we'll get there. So this is a normal human response to a sedative drug. But remember way back at the beginning I spoke of baselines. I said you start out here. As if all of you start out at that red arrow. But we know that's not true. We're all different people. We start out in different places. We have different ages, different genders, different belief systems, different ways of experiencing the world, different ways of going through life. Let's say it's a real sunny day outside. Bright sunshine, just like we've had the past few days, right? Different than that. All right, bright sunshine, it's gorgeous out. You're going outside at noon for a walk in the sun. How many of you would put on right away, as soon as you get out of the hotel, a pair of sunglasses? How many of you would not? Okay. Those of you who would put on sunglasses right away, we're going to call you stimulus augmenters, because the sun's the same to everybody, except it's not. Some of you would like to put on a pair of sunglasses. That would be your drug to control the uncomfortable sunlight, the discomfort you experience from the sun. You would like to turn the sun down. Right? Those of you who don't even own a pair of sunglasses, we're going to call you stimulus reducers. To you, the sun's not particularly obvious. It's there. Oh, that's nice. It's a sun. Sweet. And that's the end of it. No big deal. Now, I could separate you out into two groups. Stimulus augmenters, those with the sunglasses. Stimulus reducers, those who don't have sunglasses. And the bulk of you who are going to be in the middle who don't really care. Let's talk about the stimulus augmenters for a moment. You're the ones who would like to turn the sun down. You also don't particularly like loud, noisy places. You don't like to go into rooms full of raucous, loud music. It's annoying to you. Too many people, big crowds, that's annoying. It's irritating. You go to an airport, you're sitting there, you like to find a seat somewhere off in a corner away from everybody just because it's away from the hustle and bustle. You don't like going too fast on the highway. You don't like rock climbing or skiing real fast. You don't like doing things underwater because you're stimulus augmenters. The world is already too annoying, too irritating. You'd love to turn it down, right? And if you drink some alcohol, that makes you feel better. right? Turns the volume down, sedates you. The stimulus reducers, the world's a pretty quiet place, pretty calm, pretty relaxing. You'd love to turn the volume up a little bit, if you could, because you like loud, you like movies with a lot of explosions, you like if the plane gets into some turbulence, you like to drive 80 miles an hour in the left lane on the highway, that's fun. And if you could turn up the volume a little bit, maybe with a stimulant of some sort, that'd be nice. Would turn things up, make things the way they should be. So you start to realize, did I hit it right, by the way? Yeah. So you start to realize that we have a curve that looks something like this, where we've got stimulus augmenters up here, stimulus reducers down there, and we can turn the curve on its side like that. And realize, stimulus augmenters, you start out there. And when you have alcohol or Valium, you go like that. And you say, I feel the way I think everybody else feels most of the time. And you're damn right. Now, you've had the alcohol. You realize it makes you feel the way everybody else feels most of the time, and the alcohol wears off. Now you feel worse than you did in the first place, which was not all that comfortable. This is the genetic component of addiction. Not everybody who's a stimulus augmenter ends up going down the path of an alcohol use disorder. But everybody with an alcohol use disorder is a stimulus augmenter. Not everybody who's a stimulus reducer goes down the path of using stimulants, cocaine, amphetamine, so forth. But everybody who uses those drugs is on the stimulus reducer side of the fence. That's why we don't tend to go back and forth between drugs of choice. We tend to have one class that we want to prefer, we like better, does more toward what it is we're trying to achieve. This is at the heart of the genetic part of addictive disease, that the drug of choice is the drug that, at least initially, made you feel better from a discomfort that you didn't quite realize was there. When all's said and done and you get into sobriety, you're left back where you started from, uncomfortable. How do you deal with that discomfort? Well, one way of dealing with it would be to correct the fact that you're starting out up here or down here or someplace away from the normal baseline. If we could fix that, if we could make it so that you can go back to a baseline that you were never at, that would be one way of fixing addictive disease. Now, it wouldn't entirely fix it, depending upon what you identify as being addiction. Now, we all know, certainly in this room, how much addiction is based around relationships, intimacy, and issues of that nature. And if all we did was fix the genetics for you, that wouldn't solve the problem, but it would solve the discomfort. The other thing to realize is, if you take a 3 or 4-year-old who has not yet had the experiences that you've had, and you could identify and fix the genetic problem at that age, that might be all that's necessary to make it so that they don't end up going down this same path. But I said addictive disease has 3 building blocks. The reason I said that is because stimulus augmenters or stimulus reducers, or people with the genetic predisposition to addictive disease, don't automatically become people with addiction, right? There are plenty of people out there who put on sunglasses the moment they get into the sunlight who don't go down this path. What differentiates them? And that leads to building block number 2. In building block number 2, you have to have been exposed to something. And my example is a baseball story. It's a little boy who's going out to play baseball for the first time. He's only about 5 years old. He's going out to play with his friends. He has older friends, and they said, yeah, come on, we know you've never played baseball before, but we need another player. Off he goes with them. He gets put in right field because nothing happens in right field. And they figure he can't really screw up the game from there. While he's standing there, he's very excited at first, and then quickly realizes he has nothing to do. So while he has nothing to do, he sits there and says, I'm bored to death, and I'm getting sunburnt, and I'm hungry, and I have to pee. And, oh, was that a ball? And he gets the ball. And he has no idea what to do with it. And he looks out and everyone's yelling at him. And he sees a guy running. Oh, I'll throw it at the guy who's running. He throws it at the running guy, which is wrong. And everyone makes fun of him, teases him, blames him for the loss. And he goes home feeling like the goat. And he looks at his old man and he says, Dad, I blew it for everybody today. I screwed up. Everyone's mad at me. I feel awful. Dad says, God, Tommy, that happened to me too when I was your age. Forgot all about that. Tell you what, let me take you out back and we'll get a baseball and a pair of mitts and I will teach you how to play baseball so that this never happens to you again. There's no reason that you should ever feel badly like this. Let's get you out there. Or, Dad says, gosh, Don, Tommy, you suck at everything you do, don't you? The second dad, that's the dad all my patients have, right? What Tommy learned from second dad is when I feel badly, when I hurt emotionally, opening up to somebody else will make me feel worse. Tommy repetitively gets taught that through his early childhood to the extent that when Tommy's an adult, the one thing he knows never to do is share his emotions. Right? You think about it. If I had a diabetic come into my office and I said, you know what I can do? I can make it so that you can eat whatever you want. You don't need that insulin pump anymore. You don't have to worry about your retinas or your fingers or your toes. Everything's going to be great for you from this point forward. You really don't have to worry about it. But every day I want you to go into a room full of people with diabetes and say, hey, my name's Stu. I'm a diabetic. Let me share with you what I went through during my period of diabetes. They would jump up, hug me, and run to the next Diabetics Anonymous meeting. But I tell my patients with addictive disease, I can make this much better for you. By the end of 6 months, you're going to have some money in your pocket, a car that runs, kids that actually can stand you again. Maybe a family will take you back. Maybe you'll be able to go home each evening and sleep tight. Maybe your health will get better. All you have to do is go into a room full of people just like you, have had experiences just like you, and say, hi, my name's Stu, I'm an alcoholic, let me share. Well, if they jump up, hug me, and run to the next AA meeting, I made a misdiagnosis. Because that's the scariest thing in the world for a person who was raised to think that sharing intimately, emotionally with other people will hurt them. Right? The story I gave was a little boy. Little girl's story is pretty routine. It's not a baseball story. It's usually they're getting molested or abused, and they go to tell mom. And mom either says, you're lying, or mom says, yeah, you're telling the truth. That happened to me, happens to all of us. Deal with it, live with it. Or mom says, yeah, there's nothing much I can do about that. Right? So child grows up feeling disenfranchised, disempowered, and goes through life feeling the same way. Ends up with a guy that beats her up repetitively. And you sit there and you say, why is your autopilot broken? Why is it that you keep on repeating the same thing over and over and over again, even when you know every time it steers you wrong? And in relationships, I end up having to teach folks the next time somebody asks you out and your first impression is yes, say no. And if your first impression is hell no, say yes. Give it a try. But then the problem will be that that person won't turn them on, and we'll have to try and work through that. All right. So part 2 of addictive disease, the second building block, takes place at age 3, 4, 5, 6. If we're going to do primary prevention of addiction, it's not something that can happen in middle school. Has to happen in elementary school and before, which means it has to happen with the parents. So prevention occurs on a parental level. Prevention is that second building block because it's what makes it so the person who's uncomfortable by virtue of a genetic predisposition doesn't know how to cope with the discomfort. Because the normal way we cope is to be part of a herd. We're like horses. We all stand together in a group. One horse trots over there, we all trot over there with the other horse. There's not one horse standing by itself on the hill saying, I'm the individual horse. That doesn't work like that. No, they're all together as a clump. I don't think they're called clumps, but you know what I mean. Well, we work the same way. We have herds of people. You know very well if somebody's standing by himself over by the carrots back to the room, you feel like going up to that person, hey, everything okay? We want other people to be okay. That's our goal. It's the person standing there who doesn't know how to respond to the hand on the shoulder saying, hey, is everything okay? Because what he's going to do is say fine, and you know what fine means. It's not the right answer. So when we talk about addiction, when we talk about how to solve the first building block, it's how we can fix the genetic predisposition that makes you uncomfortable. When we talk about the second building block, we're talking about how to reparent an individual to such an extent that they feel that emotional and intimate sharing is something that will lead to a good outcome rather than to a bad outcome, so that they have a way of coping with the discomfort that they feel anyway as a result of the genetic abnormality that's present. Now, you do need a third building block. The third building block is that there have to be drugs that will solve the problem, albeit temporarily. Because if I took everybody with addictive disease and put them on the moon, and let's say the moon was a sober house, then they would go through their life uncomfortable, not really getting along well with other people to the extent that they can share their emotions, but they'd be getting the job done. They'd be functioning. They'd be okay. Not great. They could still use some one-to-one psychotherapy for sure, but they'd be living pretty decently. You need exposure to the drug. Without exposure to the drug, you don't realize that you can feel better. If you don't realize that, then you're not going to go in that direction. No one ever goes seeking their first drink of alcohol or their first use of marijuana or their first use of opiates saying, I wonder if this will make me feel better. That's not the usual goal. That's not the usual idea. So we have to live in a world that promotes the use of substances. Well, the United States is great for that. We love drugs. What are you supposed to do on your 21st birthday? What are you supposed to do at a marriage, at a wedding? What are you supposed to do at a wake? What are you supposed to do when you go to the game? What are you supposed, right? All these things. You watch TV. Anyone ever watch Scandal? What does Olivia Pope do all the time? She's bottle of wine with her dad. Grey's Anatomy, what do the doctors do after work? They go to the bar. It's right across the street from the hospital. How convenient is that? right? That's what you're supposed to do. Well, realize this. Here's where the problem is. Addictive disease is present in about 15% of the population. That means 85% do not have addictive disease. Well, if I'm talking about marijuana, since that's the topic of choice in many states right now, and I ask my constituents, let's say I'm a state senator, I ask my constituents, is marijuana a problem? 85% of those who have tried it will stand up and say, no problem for me. I can use it once every year, once a month, whatever, take it or leave it, don't care. It's kind of fun when I do. And that's it. 15%, a very small group of people, say it's a problem. But they don't actually say it's a problem because they don't think it's a problem. So that's the issue. What we're hearing from in this national back and forth debate on marijuana are from the people who do not have any problems with addictive disease, who don't have any problem from substance use. Let me ask you something. Remember the seatbelt argument we had years ago? The whole country went in this direction of requiring us all to wear seatbelts. We're all required to wear seatbelts, not because most of us would otherwise be thrown through the front windshield of a car at some point in our lives, but because a minority of us would be. In order to protect that minority, the whole country is willing to wear seatbelts all the time to make sure that the small number of people who otherwise would have died by chucking their heads through a windshield won't. Why is it that in this case, where 15% of the people who use the illicit substance will end up having an enormous problem as a result of it, the country is not willing to be protective? Is it because they don't care about people with addictive disease? Could that be? Could it be that people with addictive disease haven't raised their voices loudly enough to proclaim the fact that they need protecting? What needs to happen is for our society to recognize that although marijuana is reasonably okay, like alcohol is, for 85% of the population because they won't use too extreme, it's not okay for the other 15% in any amount. And therefore what we need to do is protect as best we can. So you sit there and say, all right, well, we have to balance that out against the public interest. Has it been of public interest to have 80,000 people a year die from alcohol-related use? Has that been good? Or would we rather have 40,000 people a year die if that were our choice? I think we'd go for the 40. But that ends up being a political issue. This is a political hot potato, particularly right now, where the country seems to think that they can, on the one hand, say, we oppose opiate use, and at the same time, we embrace marijuana use. You can't love one intoxicant and hate another. It's just not possible. Addictive disease doesn't work that way. So what we're sitting with right now is a situation where you've got the genetic predisposition, you have part 2, which is the environmental trigger, and you have part 3, which is a national belief that intoxicants somehow are good for us. And that overwhelms the concern we have for the opioid crisis. So there's 3 ways of dealing with it. The first, as I said, fix the genetic predisposition. We have no drug that can fix the genetic predisposition except for those with opiate use disorder where we have methadone and buprenorphine. Methadone comes close. Buprenorphine actually does a good job of moving this red dot closer to the baseline without causing the potential risks that full agonist narcotics like heroin or morphine have. In other words, you can't die from an overdose of buprenorphine. And therefore, if we look at folks who are getting Suboxone or other buprenorphine products for their opiate use disorder, there's a reason why their mortality rate drops to about 1/5 of what it would be otherwise, because we're solving this problem. Now, you're absolutely right, and I've heard the arguments here for the past few days, well, that doesn't mean they're in recovery. You're right. It does not mean they're in recovery. What it means is we've fixed the genetic abnormality. Not cured it, but we're treating it the same way as we might treat a diabetic with insulin. You're right that we still need to address part 2, the environmental trigger. For somebody to be into a solid recovery, not just that they're abstinent from a full agonist narcotic, but a real recovery. And I have to define that for this audience. But for them to be in a real recovery, they need more. But for opiate use disorders, we do have a medication that works on that part. Part 2 is, how do we deal with the environmental trigger? The fact that the child was taught not to share emotionally with others. That's what you all are here for. That's what Oxford House is for. That's what 12-Step is for. That's to reparent them in a consistent and responsible environment by people who are going to care about the individual and who will be there for them and tell them what's right, what's wrong, what to do, what not to do, just like a parent will. Doesn't mean you share everything with them. Parent doesn't do that either. It means that you are there for them, you're on their side. That's what you all do. That fixes the second thing. It's not perfect, but it's the best we can do 30, 40, 50 years down the road from the original harm. And the third building block, how do we fix that one? We continue to push the country in the direction of understanding that if you want to use intoxicants, all right, fine, be that way, but by God, you do so reasonably, right? Don't promote it as if it's the second coming, which is what we've seen with the marijuana argument, right? That the drug has medical uses. It doesn't have medical uses, come on. And I'm not talking about the substances that are in marijuana. Remember, marijuana is a plant, just like the willow tree, right? The willow tree contains in its bark salicylate. Salicylate is the primary ingredient in aspirin. But when I have a patient come into my office who has a headache, I do not look at the patient and say, you know, you ought to go strip the bark off a willow tree, crush it up, toast it, and smoke it. And I don't do that because there's no such thing as medical willow tree. But that's not to say willow tree doesn't contain a useful component that can be synthesized out and utilized appropriately as a medicine. Ditto marijuana, right? Cannabidiol does work for a very rare childhood epilepsy. Can be used for that purpose. That's not medical marijuana. That's cannabidiol. That's different. Just like salicylate is not willow tree. It's a component of willow tree. So when we're talking about marijuana that's been approved by a state legislature for medical purposes, let's not even call it medical because the medical community sure doesn't. Let's call it legislated marijuana. Unless the state legislature happens to be occupied by a group of scientists, physicians, and other clinicians who know what they're talking about. That hasn't happened. So what we're dealing with is the third building block. How do we fix the United States embrace of addictive substances? That's something we all have to do. That's something where we have to raise our voices. In each one of the states where you see this come up on the docket, you need to raise your voice and go into the state legislature and tell it like it is. Because otherwise, all they're hearing from is the 80-year-old cancer patient who gets wheeled in by a concerned significant other and who says how much better he or she felt as a result of the marijuana he or she smoked during the last few months of his or her life. And to tell you the truth, if those were the kind of patients getting legislated marijuana, I'd be all for it. But the average marijuana patient in the states that have that is 30 years old, has no history whatsoever of medical illness, but does have a history of addictive disease. Shocking. I'm shocked. Right? But that's the truth. And that's exactly what we've got in my home state in Rhode Island. That's exactly what we've seen in Colorado. That's exactly what we've seen in Washington State. So if those are the individuals who are suddenly getting marijuana for medical reasons, we've got a big problem on our hands that's even bigger than we thought. And it's not going to be obvious for another 10 years or so, at which point we will suddenly have double the number of people with addictive disease than we had before, because they're all off to the races, and they wouldn't have been otherwise. And you might say to yourself, again, this audience, you say, well, marijuana is pretty readily available anyway. I don't know anybody who couldn't get marijuana when they wanted to. That's true. But we still live in a world where about 90% of people try alcohol, about 90% of people try tobacco, only about 50 try marijuana. Why is there a difference? One's legal, one's not. You knock out about half the potential users if they think it's illegal, I shouldn't try it. Well, half those users, if it becomes legal, are going to say, I'll try it. I'll give it a shot. Let's see if I like it. It's legal, it can't be that bad. Just like tobacco and alcohol, they're fine. I'll try it too. 15% of those individuals who wouldn't have tried it otherwise will end up with addictive disease that wouldn't have had it otherwise. And then they'll go down this same pathway, and you'll meet them. Is that what we want? That doesn't make any sense. So 3 ways of fixing a disease that comes from 3 different sources. Keep your mind open to all of them. I know within the sober living community, we all tend to focus on the second building block, on the part that deals with how we interact with one another. But realize there's that first building block that's all important, which is why the drug made you feel better in the very first place. The first time you used, you got that twinkle in your eye. You got that feeling that said, oh my, right? Remember, if I take 100 people from the general population and I give them heroin, 85% of them, 85 of the 100 are going to go, I feel nauseated. Oh, I don't feel so good. I'm going to throw up. And then they lie down and they fall asleep. And they wake up the next day and they say, never give me that again. 15 of them will go, oh. Right? Those 15, they didn't know that before. But now they know. And you can't take that away. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. All right, one last story and I'm done. Imagine that I lock the doors to the room and I put up a table full of food in front. And I say, listen, I've put in some very attractive food for you all here. Don't eat it. It's poisoned. If you eat it, you'll die. Do not eat the food. And I leave. But you're locked in. Time passes. You get hungry. Eventually, one of you, despite knowing that the food is poisonous, will eat the food. Tries the food, instantly drops dead. Rest of you see the person is instantly dropped dead. And you say to yourself, oh, I don't want that to happen to me. More time passes. Eventually, one of you gets up and says, I'll try the food at the other end of the table. That won't hurt so much. Yeah. And has a little bite of the food at the other end of the table, instantly drops dead. And the rest of you will go through, gradually, your own process of working out your defense mechanism. How can I not die from eating this food? I will eat little bits of each part instead of a lot from one place. I will merely lick the food rather than chewing the food. I will inject the food rather than eating the food. I will snort the food. And yet everyone will end up dead, even the last one. And I tell this story to people who don't have a history of addictive disease, and sometimes they don't get it because they don't understand how that works. My folks with addictive disease who have seen people dying of the fentanyl that's been put in the heroin in my local area, and yet go and buy heroin themselves, sometimes from the same dealer, realizing that the same outcome could happen to them. It's the same story. They're seeing the food. They feel compelled to eat the food. They feel trapped. They feel as if they have no other way out. That's what this disease does to you. It makes you feel that you have no other way out. There's no alternative but to do the one thing that could make you drop dead instantaneously. And people without addictive disease do not understand that, because that's this. It's more than discomfort. It's a drive, it's an appetite, it's a need. That's why this is a disease, because you can learn everything else in life perfectly well, except this one thing where you feel like you have absolutely no choice. But you do. You all found it, and thank God you're all here. It's been a pleasure.